I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwyn and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Welcome to Folkloring, the podcast that takes you beyond folklore discussions and invites you to actively engage with practical folklore and magic in your daily life. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Tanya, and in today's episode, we're going to take a look at what folkloring really is and why we think it's important in our day-to-day lives.
So to kick things off, Tanya, can you share with me what you've done this week to practice folkloring?
Oh, sure. So the biggest thing that, like, I did a bunch of different things, but one of the things that gave me the biggest sort of animist tingle was that I had this this old shirt that I really love, but it was getting holes in it, and I was really planning on throwing it away. And then instead of that, I mended it, and now it's like my absolute favorite shirt again, just because I put that intention. I picked specific colors. I made, like, it was a little bit of a ceremony, and it took like 5 minutes. I sat down and I mended my shirt. Yeah, that was really kind of the biggest, breathing new life into something with ancestral skills.
Great.
Tracy, how about you? What did you do this week?
Well, this past weekend, I was attending an online conference for the whole weekend. So instead of just sitting and listening, although it was all very fascinating, I did things around the kitchen, and I baked some bread. I put a sigil into the top of the bread as my pattern because I was doing sourdough. It was terrible, but I did it.
Yep.
And I also harvested the last of my vegetables from my garden and started getting my garden ready for winter.
Nice. Okay, so let's jump into today's episode. Let's see. Folkloring is a term that we made up. It's not actually a word, but it describes perfectly, I think, what we think is important about actually doing folklore. And that is one of the reasons why we started this podcast. Tracy, do you want to tell people some more about that?
Yeah, when we started talking about this and how we incorporate folklore into our lives, we looked around, and there are a lot of folklore podcasts, and many of them are great podcasts. And I even work on one of them. But we really thought that there was something about the way that these approach the topic of folklore. And folklore really, I think at its very simplest, is shared stories and beliefs within a group. And it can be a group of two people, it can be a village, it can be an entire community. But it's really about those beliefs and those stories that are being shared. And when we look at folklore podcasts, there are a couple of different ways that it seems a lot of people approach it. One is it's an academic look. Here's what folklore looked like. Here's what people were doing. Here's how they did it, which is fascinating stuff. And then there are people who are telling folk tales, and they're telling fairy tales. And we wanted to do something a little bit different. So maybe, Tanya, you can talk a little bit about what we see folkloring as.
Yeah, so we wrote a definition of folkloring, which is something that we made up. It's not, you won't find it in any dictionary, but I'll read it to you because I do believe that it captures the essence of what we believe folkloring is. And it goes like this: the art of bringing traditional folk beliefs, stories, customs, and practices to life in your everyday existence. It's about actively engaging and celebrating the wisdom, skills, and traditions of your ancestors, infusing them into your modern lifestyle, and sharing their enduring relevance with others. So the idea behind it, and I was inspired by the concept of experiential archaeology, to think about folklore as an experiential concept. So in experiential archaeology, people go out and try to recreate with the tools of the time certain things. Like we've learned a lot about flint napping by people who started to nap flint, even though they had no teachers, they just started to do it. And the same goes for, we learned a lot about ancient textiles because people, modern textile artists, started trying to recreate ancient textiles and trying to figure out how it was done. So for me, the idea behind folkloring is very similar. Like, I believe that if we treat folklore as an experiential discipline, we will be able to learn a lot more, especially since, especially a lot of white people and people in European diaspora and European descent, we're definitely very cut off on our traditional folklore. And I believe a way to recapture the meaning of a lot of things is by actively engaging in the folklore as opposed to just reading about it or listening to stories.
Yeah, that's really interesting about, doing it and learning more about what, our ancestors that have come before us have done. And I think that there is also a really strong parallel in folklore and telling folk tales itself, because once upon a time, it was an oral tradition. People didn't write it down and capture it. They were telling these stories. And at a certain point in the 19th and 20th century, the stories, people went out, folklorists went out and started capturing these stories, and they were writing them down, and so people were getting what they saw as the authoritative view of the story, but the stories really adapt to where they are locally, or the people, what they're experiencing, what they experience as far as the different times of the year and harvest time versus winter time and all of those kinds of things. And I think that we are sort of experiencing a little bit of a renaissance now because of the internet, weirdly, because as
Right.
opposed yeah, as opposed to having the authority, the brothers Grimm, who say this is the way the story goes, and everybody buys into that, or even later, Disney movies. This is how the story
Yep.
looks. We're now getting back to stories being told person to person, and people making their own adaptations and tying it into their experiences. And so, we don't have this authority anymore. We're able to share and see these stories develop and grow and change as different people experience them.
Right, exactly. And that is a point that I wanted to make, that I believe it's so important to have people of a lot of different backgrounds, of all genders, of all religions, um, to engage with folklore, because each of us brings something else to the seeing or the experiencing of it. And for example, when we talk back about experiential archaeology, once finally women were kind of allowed in the science, they, because of their own personal experience as being a woman, could interpret archaeology, um, the archaeological finds, in a completely different way because of their own experience. So, for example, there was this knives were found in the rafters of a hut, and the male archaeologists, who had been the only ones looking at it, were assuming that it was the knives were dedicated to the gods, and so they were stuck in the rafters in order to be closer to the gods or something like that. And the first time a woman archaeologist stepped in there, said, well, actually, the knives are right over the cooking spot, and so they probably stuck them in the rafters to keep them away from the children. And I believe that the more varied our experiences are, and the more varied people look at folklore and experience folklore, the broader of a picture we're able to get.
Right. And I think that we see the stories a lot as stories to be told and not things to experience. And I think that there are a lot of stories that we get that are, giving us a moral lesson. Here's the good way to behave. Here's the right way to behave. And even, you look back at like the Ten Commandments and it's all about, don't be a jerk, don't hurt other people, and it's telling us how to behave in a certain way. But a lot of the stories that we're reading say, hey, look, if you're a bad person in this particular way, look at these bad things that are going to happen to you. And
Uh-huh.
sometimes it's for very practical reasons. There if there's a monster that is being told about in a particular body of water, well, maybe there is a lot of plant life under there and people were going in the body of water and drowning because they got caught. So sometimes there's a
Right.
practical reason for it, but I think that um, we're talking a little bit more, not just here are some big imperatives, but how do you really incorporate folklore into your daily life? And how do you think about how the folklore works with you in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, we'll get to that question later, but why would we care? Why do we want to do that?
Right.
Another point that we wanted to make is that this is not like LARPing or cosplay or reenactment. That's not the point. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Those are super fun things to engage with and definitely also learning opportunities. But the idea about folkloring is not that you're pretending to be something else. You're just incorporating folklore into your day-to-day lives and see what you can learn from it and through it. And not every piece of folklore is useful for everybody. And people have different experiences. Like, for example, in the area that I live, there's a famous animist pagan writer. Her name is Byron Ballard, and she's amazing. And she taught me about making offerings to ancestors and land spirits. And she said here at Appalachia, they really like gummy candies, super colorful, like super sweet, chemical laden. Like they like those gummies. So that's where I started. I started making offerings of gummies. But my people, my land spirits, my ancestors are not fans at all. My people want baked goods. And so that's um I wouldn't have known that. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't gone in with curiosity and an open mind and information from somebody else, because it works phenomenal for Byron. It does not work for my people, my area, my ancestors, my spirits. So yeah, mine like cookies and pies particularly. So that idea of like actually engaging with the folklore and not just saying this piece of folklore says ancestors and spirits like gummy candies, but like really looking at what's happening and what's going on and feeling into that. And that's not something you get from a book. That's only something you get from direct experience.
Right. And I think you have a unique experience. Well, maybe not unique, but a lot of people don't have the experience. I don't. I grew up in the area I currently live in. And so my experiences and the world around me are pretty much in sync. And moving from one country to another, as you did, I
Uh-huh.
it's that you bring with not only your ancestral traditions, but then how do they morph and change to fit into the landscape where you live?
Exactly. And that's definitely a question I haven't answered. Like, do my people come with me or am I dealing with new like spirits? Of course, land spirits are local to where I am right now. But a lot of those, like there's this question I saw somebody posting it online a while back. So in Holland, where I'm from, we call our gnomes kabouters, and I'm like a love the idea of a kabouter. Um, but did they come with us? Did they come with us when our people crossed the ocean or did they not? Are they purely European? And I haven't answered that question yet.
Well, that's really interesting because even when you talk about land spirits and they're local to where you are, but it could also be just coming from a different cultural experience. You're speaking to the land spirits that other people aren't because it's not, what
Right,
their parents or their grandparents were doing. And
right.
so, it wasn't like the kinds of spirits that they're putting out offerings of gummy bears to. Uh, Maybe there are, the spirits of the land that you're connecting to that they're just not, and that's fine too.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about so we've introduced our concept of folkloring and what we think it is and
Yep.
how it kind
Yep.
of works. But if it sounds like a very unfamiliar or alien kind of concept, we did want to talk a little bit about folklore that we do experience in our daily lives already. And
Yeah.
so and so it's not something that we think about a lot because these are our cultural traditions, and so they're just part of what we do. And I think that there are things that a lot of people experience, like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, that not everybody believes in, of course, but it's pretty prevalent in Western culture. And so when people are talking about those tales, I mean, those are folk tales. And have they changed over the years? Absolutely. Obviously Santa Claus became much more commercialized, but there are other examples as well. And I think that there are things like rituals that we participate in. Weddings, there are a lot of people who have a lot of rules around weddings, or,
Uh-huh.
bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, right? There are very specific, things that you do. Um,
Right.
so that being said, I think that we have a sad lack of rites of passage, and I think that that's very sad. And
Right.
I'd like to see us create more of those because those are great memories to have. Um, but then,
Yeah, and not just that. I think it definitely rites of passage set a tone to take a next step and to feel supported by your community in taking that next step. And if that is not happening, then I think it's harder for people to take the next step.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that we we even create sort of these new modern folklore experiences. We've got
Mhm.
urban myths, we've got cryptids, although maybe those are a little bit older, and even local lore. Being I'm in the Chicagoland area, and there's here's the most haunted cemetery, and here's why, and here's the story behind it. And
Yep.
I'm always surprised when someone hasn't heard of it because they're not from Chicago. Why would they?
Right. Exactly.
And so those grow and change over time. And I think that along with that, there are places that have more traditional things, like Irish dance, or I was in the UK recently, and they participate so much more in those kind of traditional parades and traditional dance, and that was so
Uh-huh.
unusual to me to start being aware of that because they put on traditional costumes, and I think that in the US where we're based, that because people come from so many different backgrounds, that just isn't a universal thing here.
Right. And I think it also depends on if you find yourself in a locality where one particular group of immigrants kind of stayed. So, you have like things like Patrick Day parades in cities where there are a lot of Irish people of Irish descent still, but like there's so much dispersal in the US that, yeah, it's hard to find those centers, those concentrations of one particular heritage.
Right. I think it's a little easier for me because sadly, Chicago is very segregated. And so
Uh,
those like people who came from, a certain place, they tended to stay together. And so I think they actually, there was always a parade for St. Patrick's Day. I think they canceled it a few years back because it got a little too out of control. And where it was on the south side of Chicago. There's a lot of Irish immigrants settled on the south side. And the
Mhm.
road that it was on one side of the road, the town that it was in allowed alcohol to be served. And on the other side of the road, they didn't. And so all of the families would be on the side of
Ugh.
the road where there was no alcohol. But apparently
Uh-huh.
the alcohol side spilled out into the street and things got out of control. So I think they canceled that. But there is still
Yeah.
those traditions, and that's it's very strong where I live.
Yeah.
So let's
Yep.
move on to talking about how we think folkloring works and how people can incorporate it into their lives. We've all got busy lives, right? And you can make time for anything you want. It's about
Right.
your priorities. And how do you fit this in while still maintaining, you've got whatever, you've got your life, your job, your family, whatever it is that's taking your time. Why do you want to do this, and
Uh-huh.
how do you do it?
Right. I feel like a lot of people, once they get somewhat into folklore, be it through reading folk stories or folk dance or folk music, usually they end up wanting something more. That's definitely my experience. And where do you go from there? And I think where you go from there is folkloring. You actually start doing it. And I think by doing it, the biggest gain you get is embodied knowledge. It helps you if once you start doing something. I was reading an article somewhere recently where they were talking about learning how to do things with your hands, like any sort of thing. Like we're also many of us, all we do with our hands really is type on a keyboard. But learning to do things with your hands, even if it's just like chopping wood or learning how to knit, things like that, it gives you embodied knowledge. And embodied knowledge makes you a more capable person, just in general. Being able to do something makes you a person that is able to do that thing. And that seems very simple and unimportant, but it's really not. And I notice, especially in children, I have years and years of experience teaching children, and my particular favorite is teaching children working with their hands. And I have never seen a child so happy and full of life and interested in learning as when they learn a skill like with their hands, as opposed
Mhm.
to they learned how to dissect a sentence or they learned how to solve an equation. That's never as exciting as they learned how to make a candle or they learned how to weave a basket or they learned how to knit a sock. And I think it's very similar in folklore. Like it's elating to tap into this stream of knowledge that has carried our ancestors forward and is still there for us to be buoyed on as well. Learning folklore and actually engaging in it, I think it helps you stand fully in life, and not just in the mundane world, but in all the worlds, not just in the human world, not just in the modern world, but in the past and in the future, as well as the present, as well as other realms. And as I said, it helps you become a more capable human. Um, and it helps you. So instead of just reading about something, actually participating in folklore, it helps you learn through all your senses. And so, an example for me, when I learned how to identify plants, I used to go on walks in fields and forests and stuff, and it was just like this sea of green, right? Like beautiful, wonderful. Maybe there's a flower here and there, and maybe this is a daisy and that's a rose or something like that. But once I really learned how to identify plants, a whole nother world opened up for me. And now when I go for walks, I see individuals and individual species, but individual plants as well. And I have knowledge of how those plants can fit into my life and how I can fit into their life, which, yeah, it makes you a different human, I believe.
One thing that I thought was really fascinating when I was starting to learn about plants, and you know far more than I do, but I thought it was fascinating to discover that where you find like poison oak, poison ivy, you find jewelry,
Mm-hmm.
and jewelry is, you know, the
Right,
what you do to treat that. And when you start to
right,
realize that nature is connected in those different ways, and you want to be connected to it as well, it's just
right,
once you start to understand how, you know, the trees do, they communicate with each other, right? And if a tree gets cut down, sometimes the trees around will provide food to the
right,
roots. And how can you not want to
right.
be connected to that once you start to understand that that all exists everywhere around you?
Right, exactly. And yeah, so for specifically for plants, for example, and you use the example of jewelweed, for me, yes, learning that, okay, jewelweed is really useful if you get poison ivy or poison oak or general skin rashes or things like that. But then learning another layer on top of that where it makes a phenomenal yellow dye, really beautiful, easy to procure dye for fabric. And then another layer on top of that is like what are the energetics of this plant, like what planet, for example, is it ruled by, or how has it been traditionally used in folklore and folk magic and folk medicine and things like that. And then I feel like once you start to approach a plant um, from that manner, not so much of what can you give to me, but how can we coexist and what can we give to each other, um, you come into relationship. And I think that is also, I do believe that folklore is infused with animist principles, and that idea of coming into relationship with something other than humans, yeah, is
Well,
very
and I think
enriching.
that when you're talking about the different layers, I think that that's a really good um, way to look at what we're thinking about as folkloring, because maybe never in your life are you ever going to make a salve on your own for a rash that you have. That's just not your thing. You love
Yeah,
textile, and so you're going to use
right,
that plant to make your
right,
dye, and that's perfectly valid to only want to use it for that. And so it's about
right.
finding what resonates with you, what excites you, what interests you, and remembering how exciting it was as kids when we're learning things, and um, how much fun it is to see where it is, what paths you want to go down personally, and what you want to learn about, and what you want to do more of.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Then another point about why it's interesting and a good way to engage with folklore, I believe, to like learn things like when you pick up a new skill, like be it knitting, for example, or spinning, or foraging, herbalism, things like that. It's awkward and strange in the beginning. I remember when I first started baking sourdough, I had to have the recipe right next to me. Everything had to be weighed out perfectly. I was looking at it 50 times a day. And it was like a whole thing. But now it's nothing. It takes no time. I bake all the bread for my family every week, and I feel like um, the that lineage of baking bread that people have been doing for like what 12,000 years is living through me now, as opposed to, and it's not effortful. It's almost effortless because that energy is now living through me, as opposed to I'm putting so much energy into it. And it's the same with um, just about every ancestral skill. At first, it's difficult to learn, especially if it's brand new to you and you didn't grow up in an environment where it was shown to you or even around. But eventually, it that you I read this thing somewhere. It said first you practice the skill, and then the skill practices you. It something can live through you, something that is bigger than you, by picking up old knowledge. And yeah, folklore is just full of that, and it's definitely enriching because you can learn how to knit in a very one-dimensional way, right? You just learn how to knit, but you can learn how to knit in a very magical way and in a very ancestral way, and in carrying a lineage forward, and using it in a sense as folk magic, which is how it was used often originally.
Well, and
Yeah.
I think that some of these skills, it once you start to practice them and they become something you're doing because you don't want the thing at the end, you want the experience. And I think that's why people quilted
Exactly.
together, and people would, or they, when they knit, they're becoming, they get into a meditative state, and it calms your mind, it
Uh-huh.
calms who you are, and then it's more about, again, having that experience, as opposed to sort of the consumerist way that we look at things a lot, which is, I want that sweater or whatever it is. And when you were talking earlier
Right.
about repairing, the shirt, and it
Uh-huh.
as opposed to, I need a new shirt because this one is old. Well, now it's got another layer because you've put in some sweat equity into it, right? And you've
Right.
you've gotten closer
Exactly.
to that garment, and so it's more valuable. And it's just through
Uh-huh.
working with it.
Right. Exactly. Which comes for me to a point of using folklore and things like animism and perhaps paganism in a sense of anti as an anti-capitalist movement as well, and anti-imperialist. Like when we infuse our life force into something, it becomes much more meaningful. And then if that is carrying on an ancestral tradition, it's even more meaningful and important.
Right, right. And I think there are also other
Yeah.
reasons to prioritize doing these activities in your life. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, yes, it is definitely a carrier of tradition, right? These are skills
Yep.
that we have been isolated from. And those skills are valuable, as you were saying earlier, for learning them. I remember
Right.
some years ago when my father was still alive, he came to my house. I had a broken window, and my house is 125 years old. And so it had the original windows on the first floor, or it still does have. And so when the window broke, I couldn't just get
Mhm.
someone over to come, like, put in a new double pane, right? And so he came to me,
Right.
and he said, "Okay, I'm going to show you how to glaze a window." And and we had to go
Uh-huh.
and get there's these little triangle shaped, bits that you put in, and how to do the caulking correctly and all of
Yep.
that. And it was just such a lovely afternoon of sharing that experience with my dad. And
Yep.
I have not needed to do it again. But if I did need to do it again, I would know exactly how to do it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. um I forget what I was going to say.
Sorry, I got excited.
And that No, it's okay. And I also want to say that now, since that was your father who taught you, like that's carrying on a lineage, right? And I see that in my own life where, um, and it's a very sort of segregated by gender in our house at least, but my husband teaches the kids how to split wood and how to fix a car and how to do all that stuff, and I teach the kids how to cook and how to sew and things like that. But they're being taught that, and I see our children, who are all young adults now, being a lot more capable than a lot of other children in their age range, just because they got that. There wasn't, you didn't we don't so much go and get somebody and pay them to fix whatever needs fixing or do whatever needs doing. We try to do it ourselves first. And then, yeah, our children are around that and
Well, and
learn
I think
these
that it's
skills.
important to recognize that we have moved away from the really strict gender roles that I know I had when growing
Right.
up. I was lucky because, well, I was kind of a daddy's girl, and so I like to spend a lot of time with my dad. And he was the one who fixed stuff around the house. So I got to have that
Yeah.
experience of learning
Hmm.
those things, and my mom was the one who cooked. And so I had, both of those experiences with my parents that I think a lot of people my age wouldn't necessarily have crossed the traditional gender lines that they believed in.
Right. 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 Yeah, totally. Um, let's see. There's another point that I wanted to make, and I'm not sure if this is exactly where it should go. But we should cut it out. We could cut it out if it doesn't work out. But I wanted to make the point of when we look at traditional and most of what when we look at meditation, most of what we see here in the West is imported from Eastern philosophies, which is a form of meditation that often seeks stillness and emptiness, which is, and I'm not speaking about human genders, but about energies right now. It's an often a very masculine way of meditating. And for myself, that works sometimes, but often I feel like more drawn to more feminine expressions of meditation, which is more about fullness and creation, um, and movement often. So I find a lot of these traditional crafts and practices to be a perfect venue for forms of meditation that are more like that. So I don't often just sit and meditate, but I often knit and meditate. Or dance and meditate, which I feel like is a form of meditation that is often lacking. The access to that, or even the knowledge of that, is often lacking in um, Western culture as I experience it. It's usually the focus is like we should all meditate, and this is what it should look like. You sit on your yoga mat and you're quiet. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's it's a very interesting point that you kind of and again it comes from having this believed in authority of telling us how we should do things. I was fascinated when I first
Hmm.
heard the concept of walking meditation, and it was like, oh, of course.
Yep.
But how often instead of
Yeah.
that am I going to go out on a walk and be like, oh, I've got these 7 podcasts I'm listening to, I better get through a couple episodes. you know um,
Right. Right.
and so,
Exactly.
using the time where you're doing something else to quiet your mind is something that we don't get to experience as often as we should, because we're always saying, like, we need to create, we need to do more, we need to, experience more, learn more. And we don't slow
Uh-huh.
down, but you sort of bridge the gap there, right? Like if you're knitting, you are creating
Yeah.
something, but you're also
Yep.
giving yourself the grace and the space in order to quiet your mind as
Yep.
well. And the repetitive movements
Yep.
of it, I think, are interesting because that's what lulls you into that meditative state, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And another point that I think I wanted to make is just that sparked when you said we're always on the go and always trying to do more. I feel like a lot of what is happening to us as a culture is that we're trying to consume
Mhm.
more. And what I think what is really healthy for our psyche is to learn how to produce more. And by that, I don't mean like go to work more. I think that's already an issue, but learning, producing more and maybe needing less and definitely consuming less, I think is healthy for us as a
Well,
people.
and I think too that we have gotten to a point where a lot of people are isolated, or even a family unit will be more isolated. We don't have the kind of community we used to, and I think that a lot of people have taken to developing relationships with their stuff because of that lack of connection with, the stories of the people.
Interesting.
And so I think that, and
Yeah.
not saying that I'm immune to that. I am a big collector. It's terrible. I'm trying to, but I love my stuff. I love it. And I've been trying to
Yeah.
learn a little bit more on how to let go of that, because I like to do crafty things. I make a lot of jewelry, and I started doing little sculptures, and I was terrible at first, but I did get better, and I learned how to do it. And so now I have a lot of little clay octopuses. Don't know why I picked octopuses. Um, but it's not that I have them. It was the act of making them that I so enjoy.
Making them.
And
Yep.
so I'm getting to a point where I look around, I'm like, I have got to get rid of all of this stuff, because it's not about the stuff, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk
For
about that
sure.
game, shall we? Let's talk about, how do people start doing this? How do they start folkloring?
Uh-huh, exactly. Well, I think one of the things that is interesting to do is to look at what your ancestry is like. And most of us are a mix of a bunch of different ones. So pick one that you're attracted to, or just even if you're not at all related by blood to any sort of ancestry, pick one that draws you. And then I find it very useful, and it makes me feel connected to a society by cooking their traditional foods. And I remember, like, some years ago, I got obsessed with Ossetians, which nobody has even heard of. But they live in the north of the Republic of Georgia, and they're kind of related to the ancient Scythians. And somehow I was obsessed with those people, and I read a lot about them. And then I started cooking their traditional foods. And I am not at all related to Scythians or to that area in the world. But yeah, making those foods and trying to come up with herbs and vegetables and meats that those people would have access to back in the day, and then putting together some of their traditional foods was fascinating and very fun. And I still, on traditional Dutch holidays, I always cook Dutch food. Sometimes my children ask for Dutch food for birthdays and things like that.
That's interesting,
Yeah.
because I had an experience recently. I have a friend who lives in Kiev, and at the time of this recording,
Uh-huh.
they've been experiencing, attacks for a year and a half, 2 years. And so
Mhm.
she didn't always have power. She didn't always have, but when she did have power, we spent a lot of time jumping on calls together. And one time she was
Uh-huh.
talking about making borscht. And I said, "Oh, you got to give me your recipe." And she said, "You know what? I'll do one better," because we were always on video calls. And she said, "Get the ingredients. I'll give you a list of the ingredients, and we will make it together." And
Oh,
we
so
took an
fun.
afternoon and just set up my computer in the kitchen, and we chatted and talked and had such a great time. And she taught me, her way of making it. And now I've always got that. And we had, the
Yeah.
hanging out in the kitchen, drinking your coffee and talking, and we had the ability to have that kind of community. And now I've got this whole new experience that, I want to do it again. I want to make, more of these foods, and has nothing to do with my background.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. But then if it does have anything to do with your background, or if it is something, an ancestral lineage that you're interested in finding out more, I find cooking the traditional foods, is a phenomenal way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're right about that, because those traditional foods, they again spoke to the area they came from. They, the kinds of foods that could be grown
Uh-huh.
there. And so of course you're going to incorporate that. And,
Right.
the why, why do people in areas that are really hot eat a lot of spicy food? It seems counterintuitive. It helps them cool
Right.
off. And I I learned
Right.
a while back that if you experience spicy food as a little kid, then you're much more prone to like it as an adult because it feels dangerous. It's
Ah,
painful, right? But then once you learn
yeah, yeah,
over and
yeah.
over that you can have that pain, but it doesn't mean you're in danger or something bad is going to happen to you. And so people get to like that sensation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Um, I want to say that if you are not an experienced cook, I do think that it can be very simple. Like if you're looking at maybe a Northern European heritage, you can start just making a bowl of oatmeal, right? That was one of the grains that grew really well in Northern Europe. And so lots of generations of people, Scotland, Ireland, they grew up on oats. And so just start with a bowl of oatmeal and see if you can take it further. You do some research on, when oats were first grown and first consumed by those people, or how exactly. Like I know, especially in Scotland, there is a million different ways to use oats, from just basic oatmeal to like fermented oat drinks and things like that. And also, of course, it's just infused with folklore. And yeah, like feel into that. Like, maybe you want to make sure that you stir your oats in a sunwise direction as it was done in Scotland. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of practices that I mean, obviously food is something we all need. And so we're all going to experience our relationship with it. And I think that building a greater relationship that does tie back to some of these traditional ideas and where you're from. And it plays into our genetics even, right? Because we've
Right.
all got genetic mutations, and we get them from
Uh-huh.
our lineage. And so it's maybe I'm going to be missing a nutrient that my ancestors ate a lot of a particular food that makes that nutrient more available. And I
Yep.
think that there are those kinds of things
Yep.
that we don't even think about, those ties to our past. We're living in the present and going to the grocery store and buying oranges in February and whatever it is that we do.
Right.
And I
Yep.
think that's, like we talk about, oh, nobody knows how to do canning anymore. Well, in a very real way, nobody needs to do canning anymore. But then you
Right.
decide, what is the trade-off? If I'm not going to can my tomatoes out of my garden, right? Then how much time do I have to
Yeah.
spend earning money and going to the store
Right.
and buying, the canned tomatoes? And how does that impact my health? Because they're not local and they're maybe in a
Uh-huh.
can with
Right.
BPAs or whatever. And so
Yep.
when you say, oh, I don't have time to do all of that, it's like, well, you're choosing to do, other things that allow you the conveniences. And conveniences are perfectly fine. I do
Exactly.
not, I don't bake all of my bread like you do. I'm very jealous. But I do it sometimes, and sometimes I decide that I've made some commitments and I've got to write up my outline for the next podcast episode or whatever it is. And I don't have time to do that. And so
Right.
you have to find the balance. And I hate the term work-life balance because it implies that they're two different things. And part of what I want
Right.
to achieve here is saying, no, it's all your life. And so where you're
Right.
spending your time is, why should you not spend it on the things that bring you the most joy and the most magic and the most connection that you can possibly have? And that's kind of what, when I think about why are you taking the time to do these things, it's because you are trying to broaden yourself and then the universe that's available to you.
Exactly. Yeah. And just the connection that you get with your
Mhm.
land. I mean, if you're growing your own tomatoes, for example, you started those in February from seeds, or at least where I live. I start my tomatoes in February from seeds. And, I just harvested my last one. Like that was a 9 months of life with
Right.
those
Right.
plants, right? Um, yeah. And, now I'm saving some of their seeds for next year. So there's more, there's like, it's an ongoing
Right.
communion with those tomatoes, even though that sounds funny. But then in December, when I put a pot of pasta sauce on the table from, the tomatoes that I grew myself, it's a whole different experience than if I just open a can from the grocery
Right.
store.
It's, maybe you don't have the space to grow anything, right? But maybe you've got a
Right.
windowsill
Right.
and you can have your favorite herb growing there. And
Yep.
so it's about choosing things that work for your life, that you can incorporate, that don't feel like an obligation or a burden. And so you
Right.
have to choose. And I mean, just like folklore is
And
never
yeah,
ending,
that's
right? You can go on,
right.
but this is, you have to just pick what resonates with you, I guess.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And you could choose to build slowly if you even choose to do so. But like what my experience has been that pretty soon things become
Mhm.
automatic, right? You don't have to think about them so much anymore. Like when I first started growing tomatoes, it was so much work and intention and focus had to go to it. And now, I mean, it's still a good bit of work, but it's not nearly as much as it used to be. And that is like the point, I think, of folkloring as well, is that it needs to fit into your life. And sometimes that means you need to pay a bit more attention and a little bit more time in learning a particular skill or a particular set of customs.
Right.
And if you hate that, then don't do it. Pick something
Right.
else. But if you enjoy it, pretty soon it becomes part of your
Yeah, I
existence,
think back to the
and
I
not a
think back to the
burden.
time that I decided what would be really good for my garden was to uh, put crushed eggshells in. So at first, every time I'd
Uh-huh.
have eggs, I'd have to be like, oh, I got to rinse these out. I got to, crush them up. And now it's like, I don't, when you get in the car and you suddenly arrive someplace and you're like, how did I
Yeah.
it's like that. It's
Right.
like my
Yeah.
eggshells just go into the crock that I, store them in. And every once in a while I go grind
Yep.
them up, and I've got more than I can ever use.
Yep.
But I don't think about it anymore. I don't have to remember to do it because it's part of how I make eggs.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so any other advice we're going to get in later episodes? We're really going to start talking about much more specific folklore and things to do. This was kind of a general overview, and depending on what the
Yep.
topics are, we're going to get into a lot more detail on things that you can specifically choose to do. But for now, Tanya, do you have any other thoughts, advice on how people can start moving toward a lifestyle of folkloring?
Well, I think hitting the subscribe button would be a good start because we will be putting out a bunch more episodes with specific information, as you just said. But I feel, yeah, for this episode, I feel pretty
Okay,
complete.
great. If anyone wants to shoot us a message or ask us anything about that, we welcome that. We'd love to get into dialogue with you. So feel free to reach out whenever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope we catch you on the next episode.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.